Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka Saxena, your host for this episode and staff research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program. And today, I'm delighted to have with me my guest for this episode, Dr. April Hurlevy. She is an expert on the People's Republic of China, especially foreign policy and security policy of the country, economic statecraft for technology acquisition, and the increasing role of the PRC in commercial, economic, and military domains. Her research has extensively focused on the PRC's tech tactics, innovation strategies, global infrastructure development, and of course, the modernization of the People's Liberation Army. And she is affiliated with CNA in the US. Dr. Hurlevy, as part of CNA, has published research on rather excellent topics ranging from port operations along China's maritime Silk Road to even a paper on how the PRC is upgrading technologically and how it engages with theft of foreign tech for its own military purposes. So I'm really excited to have you, Dr. Hurlevy, for this conversation today. And without further ado, let's get right into it. So I was hoping today we could have a discussion on the state of geopolitics today. And increasingly, we're finding that everything has a security angle to it, ranging from tech geopolitics being a matter of national security, even military interest, to the economics of geopolitics or geoeconomics, which have, again, become weaponized tools that countries are increasingly using as part of statecraft, something that you specialize in and have worked on. And especially when, there's a dignitary like you who is based in the US, but also looks in depth at China and at foreign policy and national security, I just can't miss the opportunity to first ask you. So in this very tumultuous world today, where all of this, to use an investment term, securitization of economics or tech, or all things geopolitics rather, is happening, what is the American worldview on some of these things? What is shaping how the US is looking at things like strategic competition in the world today? What's the perspective of the current administration led by Donald Trump? And in particular, the one thing that the US was always appreciated for, and this is something that was thought to be its strength, which is still is thought to be its strength, which is its alliances. So how is the Trump administration approaching that issue in the tumultuous world today? Over to you, Dr. Hurlevy.
First, I just say thank you for inviting me to be part of this opportunity. I actually read the work of this institute regularly. They've done some great work in the past on the Global Security Initiative. So I'm really excited to be talking to you. And I'm going to turn your question around a little bit just because I think we have securitization happening in a lot of places. And actually, because my research is focused on China, I'm going to start there because we see the trends in securitization of national security policy in China, I would say first. This is one of those interesting dimensions that often, people look to the US as doing things first, but I actually think it was trends in China that started this securitization spiral, what we're seeing. 20 years ago, and I did a lot of research early in my career in economics, you could do economic research in China, and there was nothing sensitive about that. It's actually why I did my dissertation on economic matters, because I knew it would be easier to access the important materials to understand that. But under Xi Jinping, there has been an increasing shift to everything as national security. If you read the planning documents of the Chinese Communist Party, food security, water, environment, economic data, everything now is national security. And in some ways, this is a holistic concept of national security, which is understandable for a country. But in a way, it also makes it problematic. If everything is securitized, how do you actually have conversations? And is that the right framework? I still talk to a lot of scholars, and for certain types of problems, the security framework may not be the best way to approach it. So we see that happening in China. And then I think there was an awakening in the United States. And it was before 2018. I'll get to 2018 in a moment. But you had a recognition of basically politicians that were not quite happy with the way things were going in the global economy. But there was also a recognition that and again, this is my personal opinion. It doesn't represent the organization I work for, but my personal opinion is, we hadn't in the United States invested as heavily in the World Trade Organization, some of the other international bodies. And so then when those bodies were no longer functioning, then there was a recognition of, some of these systems we set up in the post-World War II era aren't working. And I take, as an American, full responsibility for some of that issue. But what happened then is, again, we saw the securitization. Also, this relates in China to military-civil fusion. So if everything can be shared with the PLA, that's a huge problem for U.S. policy. We've always had our longstanding policy about dual use. We were happy to sell stuff that was used in the civilian sectors, but we had concerns about selling certain technologies that could be used in the military sector. But in China, it's hard to know. I mean, quite frankly, the military civil fusion means that it likely is going to go, you're not going to know the end user. I've argued in other venues that I think the challenge right now with dual use technology is, what does that mean? Everything's dual use. AI could be in military and civilian. So you have that, and then turn around or fast forward, you get to 2018. So the first Trump administration, it's all about tariffs. I mean, we're seeing that in Trump 2.0, but I bring that up because I'll be completely honest with you. In my career, I used to teach undergraduate students about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1920s and 1930s. And I never thought we'd be living in a world where we're talking about tariffs again, but here we are. And there's a variety of domestic reasons we can talk more about. But as that took shape, there was a recognition that it wasn't just about tariffs, though. It was about this longstanding issue of intellectual property theft, China going after military technology quite aggressively. A lot of that stuff doesn't always make the media reporting, but that was occurring. And so the U.S. said, well, there was a perception that we needed to be more cognizant of protecting our own technology. And I think fast forward now to where we are today, both countries have securitized their national security policy. And that is fraught with tension in terms of the relationship. But I think that's a larger issue. And the American worldview is that, if you talk to leaders 20, 30 years ago, we did a lot to help China's economy grow. Quite frankly, our businesses. And I think there's sometimes a perception in Beijing, or maybe a purposeful forgetting of that. Because at the end of the day, we did, and we believed in that. But China made choices too in terms of the direction it wanted to go. And so unfortunately, we see a divergence in terms of where China and the United States are going in the future. And I'll leave it at that. We could talk more about any of those issues.
Right. No, that's an absolutely interesting and fascinating assessment, Dr. Hurlevy, because now, and sitting here in India, we are also looking at New Delhi, Washington tensions. And I think there's a consistent discussion and mention of the fact that, mutually meeting that China challenge was something that brought India and the US closer together, in addition to the mutual benefits that were to be had in other domains like tech and talent sharing or defense or anything else, right? So exchange of know-how. So now we see that the Trump administration, pursuant to all of the developments that you talked about, has taken a stance where now suddenly the focus is on Russia and meeting the Russia challenge, even though we thought that, China will be perceived as a strategic competitor, the structural rival to the US. And so now with the shifting of the focus on Russia and the tensions that has created with India, in addition to the evidences that Trump wants a deal with Xi Jinping. If I'm not mistaken, he said something to the tune of, a deal with China would be very good. It would be something great. So these two factors are bringing in divergences, right? And this is why I made the point about alliances and those being the American strength. So what would your take be on that? would you say that no, meeting the Russia challenge with the steps that have been taken now is important and we'll deal with China later? Or the US shouldn't have been going in the direction that it is with China, which is trying to strike a bargain?
This is a great question, but it's a challenging one. And as an American, it's really hard to know on any given day what is going on in President Trump's mind. My personal impression is just this isn't about grand strategy or things like that. I mean, he's a deal maker. He believes, and that deal might be with China, might be with India, might be with Russia. I don't know who, and I think it's impossible to predict. But I think that's the idea. So there seems to be this sense of this is a successful negotiating tactic. We'll see whether or not that's true or not. But where I sort of hold out hope as an American that's looked at foreign policy, and actually I used to teach U.S. foreign policy in addition to Chinese politics. When I think about it, I do like to remember that we've gone through other difficult times with other countries and in our foreign policy. And quite frankly, the United States has always had to rely on its allies. And I think that's been throughout, World War II and beyond in the Cold War. And I like to remind people that U.S. alliances have withstood many different political administrations, and not just changing political parties, but really contentious issues. I mean, like I said, when I used to teach U.S. foreign policy, we would talk about the Vietnam War. I mean, sometimes people forget how truly contentious that was. Quite frankly, Nixon's decision to go to China and balance the Soviet Union by engaging with China, controversial at the time. Some allies did not want this. So I guess I think one of the keys is I think our challenges with social media and our access to information, we're always looking at what is going on this minute, in the next 5 minutes, and I do think sometimes we need to step back and take that longer term perspective. And I know it's hard to do. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but I do think there is strength in alliances. I think we need to remember that and recognize that those withstand political realities. And so I guess that's where, as an American, I still hold out hope that, there's always room for agreement with every country. And quite frankly, I don't limit it. I think U.S. and India have some issues to resolve, but U.S. and China still have to talk about hard issues. I was in the previous seminar we just ran here. We were talking about climate change. That's a global problem. Everyone still needs to have those conversations, regardless of the rhetoric or the politics coming out of specific capitals. Those are global issues, and I think we still need to have those dialogues, and I hope people do.
Right. Of course. And I tend to agree with you on this, that the suspension of high-level political dialogue has never really done any of the two sides any good. Maintaining communication also ensures that if push does come to shove in really contentious regions like the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea, having that line of call and communication is essential. And to build that, you would then need a foundation of dialogue, negotiation, and back and forth. So I absolutely tend to agree with you on there. And I think in India also, we're adopting a similar policy with both China and the US. But yeah, remains to be seen what the outcomes are, and if they materialize into a deal that perhaps President Trump would like. But just on the security aspect of dealing with China, I think, and this is my understanding, but please correct me if I'm wrong. There is still an understanding in the US that China is a massive security threat, and somewhere or the other, policy strategies do focus on ensuring that there isn't espionage, there isn't stealing of military tech. And you did a wonderful long paper about this in 2020. And if we put that kind of strategic planning in the context of the fact that there is otherwise a little bit of a turmoil evident in the American national security architecture. And this is me sitting here in India, so I'd love to hear your take on this. But recently, post the issue about the leaking of the signal chats, there was the firing of General Timothy Haw as director of the National Security Agency. Then recently, I think a couple days ago, Pentagon Intelligence Chief Lieutenant General Jeffrey was removed as Defense Secretary. these again are very high profile removals. So is there some mismatch in the vision of the executive and the Pentagon, or are there divergences on how to deal with China and Russia? What's your take on some of these?
I'll start with the views of China first, because those views still exist. And the fact of the matter is that report that you referenced in 2020 that we wrote, we continue to update that. And what's fascinating to me is there's more and more cases that have hit the media that are actually closer to espionage. When we did that original report, it was more about sort of the surreptitious ways that China acquired foreign technology, and those haven't changed. Those are still happening. What has changed is the tactics. I mean, what we see is more creative venues to do it, and quite frankly, with the use of hackers and cybersecurity, this is an issue, and this is actually broader than just the national security establishment. If you look at businesses, cybersecurity attacks are still a huge issue, and the amount of money that's had to be poured into that to ensure security. So those are still very strong issues. And again, I bring it up for business too, because it's like businesses just don't want to do businesses, but how do you do business if you have ransomware, if you're going to get shut down, or all of your data is getting stolen? And so we see that on the specific national security side. Again, we do, like I said, some of those cases of espionage have actually hit the media. And what we find really interesting about that is it is an aggressive program to get access to our technology. And I like to think of it as like, your friends don't do that to you, or at least they shouldn't. And so, of course, there's going to be concerns. But the broader security concern about China is the way it does business. If we look at the South China Sea and the recent collision of the Luoyang destroyer with the Chinese Coast Guard vessel, this is about how you treat your neighbors. I mean, the U.S. is not there. This was not a U.S. thing. But is that the right way to treat the Filipino Coast Guard? I understand they have territorial disputes, but I think U.S. leaders have concerns about that kind of behavior. I mean, basic safety at sea is essential. And if you're flouting those rules to your own detriment in that particular instance, that's not okay. Sometimes what doesn't get as much attention is they're doing some of those activities in the East China Sea in terms of patrolling the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands. Doesn't get as much attention because they don't treat the Japan Coast Guard the way they do the Philippine Coast Guard. And so what is that about? Could that change? There have been periods of tension between China and Japan. So some of that is, how do you treat your neighborhood, your neighbors, and your neighborhood that you operate in? And is that the proper way to do that? And then, of course, you can't talk about the security concerns without talking about Taiwan. And obviously, the U.S. has a complicated history with Taiwan. China-Taiwan relations have a complicated history. And we can talk about that issue separately, but that is still a concern. And the agreement has always been not to solve that problem with military force, but Xi Jinping has told the PLA they need to be capable of undertaking an invasion of Taiwan by 2027. Now, to be clear, I don't think that's a deadline. I don't think that's hey, we're going to go invade Taiwan in 2027. But it does send a message. If you're saying that your military has to be ready for that, I mean, that's a real threat for Taiwan, and they have to take that credibly. So I think those security concerns all exist. I don't think those have gone away. To your point about the sort of tumultuous nature of what's going on in the U.S., yeah, I personally have concerns about this. Well, as some of the people that have been dismissed from their military posts, these are experienced, seasoned professionals with long careers that have done amazing work serving the United States of America. And when I see those people taken out for what I assume are political reasons, I do have concerns about that. I think we have a lot of conversations internally. Is this just about making a loyal force? I mean, I think there's some sort of perception in the Trump administration about valuing loyalty. And there's a perception that if someone's not loyal, but that's not how civil servants operate in the United States. In the United States, civil servants take an oath to the Constitution. And this is where people say, what is rule of law? It seems esoteric, but literally civil servants, when they start their government service, they take an oath to the Constitution. And I think it's important to note that, because that's what makes democracy, or at least the American version of democracy, viable and vibrant, and that's who those civil servants serve. So I do have concerns about that. There's not easy solutions for that, because the president does get to choose on some levels their leadership. And so there's definitely a tension there, and we'll continue to watch. And I hope that kind of taking people out stops, but we'll see what happens.
Right. No, and very interesting stuff. Firstly, in the point that you made about how China treats its neighbors. I mean, again, sitting here in India, we're at least the threat that's posed on both the continental and the maritime borders of India, in addition to concerns regarding the power differential and how China uses it, have been persistent since, as long as any of us and many others can remember. And yes, I think. On that front, and this is something we try to articulate at Takshashila often, it seems to be Beijing's perspective that there can only be one tiger on the hill, and regionally there is no scope for multipolarity, even as China tries to mobilize India and other regional countries to help achieve multipolarity at the global stage. So it would accept that globally, but regionally there has to be unipolarity, and China has to be at the top of it all. So I think that's with China's rise, that's a view going in that the CCP has adopted, and eventually it has had the outcomes which, as you rightly pointed out, are to its own detriment. And even on the point about the oath to the constitution, again, we have a similar model in India, and rule of law is what differentiates the American democratic view on this with the Chinese one, perhaps, which is rule by law, right? And then that has different consequences altogether. Speaking of which, if I could now maybe have a conversation with you about the Chinese military. I just wanted to understand, since you've been looking at their modernization for so long, where do you think they stand today on the intelligentization pillar? So it seems that they've gone from mechanization to informatization already, but now there's focus on integrating intelligent technologies and making soldiers intelligent, as it were, with new gear, new weapon systems at their disposal. So have you been tracking that progress, and what is your take on that?
No, it's such a great question. And when it relates to the PLA, the biggest question I have is to understand and to analyze this. What is the difference, or what's the cut point between informatization and intelligentization? Because you need the systems in place that actually have the command and control and the communications technology to move to that next level. And actually, I didn't personally do the study, but some colleagues of mine, Kevin Peter and Amanda Kerrigan, who have now since moved on to other positions, they wrote a whole study that's on our website about the intelligentization issue. Of course, not an easy. I'd rather say the Chinese Zhernanghua is actually easier to say, but that's what we're stuck with. Because they have so many aspirations. Like there's so many things, and there is potential. I mean, thinking about large language models or the machine learning and how you could speed up decision making, I think there's a lot of opportunities for the PLA to get better, to improve its command and control. And they talk about all that. So that report actually outlines many different facets of what they're talking about. But what's so difficult, and you know this from like reading Chinese documents, is it aspirational or is it happening? So we have this debate internally, like with our team all the time, is like, has this stuff happened, or is this what they're trying to do? I do think the long-term plan is to improve decision-making systems. But what's challenging for the PLA is I wonder if they're trying to just make those less reliant on humans, which could be good or bad. So if you don't trust your decision makers, then having a software-based solution that provides your commanders with, maybe the best option might be a good model. It's something like, for instance, in the US military, we wouldn't do because we trust our commanders and we know that they make good decisions. So we wouldn't want to leave all the decision making to a computer or software system. But this brings it back up to the strategic level. So if you look at what's going on in the PLA, and Xi Jinping has continued to purge leaders. Taylor Fravel just has a new article out in Foreign Affairs, I think, on this very topic, if people are interested. And it's this idea of, if you trust your decision makers, would you be purging them? Probably not. But then we don't know why. We don't know exactly, was it corruption? The allegations are corruption. But was it incompetence? Was it not moving fast enough to achieve the goals they are meant to achieve? But then you go back to the gaps in the Central Military Commission. And so there is a tension, because my hunch is they have not intelligentized yet. They have a lot of aspirations. but we're not yet seeing it. Where I do think it's interesting is there's a lot of media reporting that they are using it for wargaming. They are using it for training and simulation. So I think they are starting to use it, but they're not even yet where they say their aspirations are in terms of their goals. So I think the issue to watch, and for anyone listening out there that is a researcher, an area where a lot more research I think needs to be done.
Right. No, I think that's an absolutely fascinating analysis. And I think this viewpoint about why perhaps the purges may be happening again, like you said, we have no official confirmation, but this viewpoint is very important because it's always a struggle to differentiate between the chest thumping and the realities on the ground. Perhaps in many places and in many militaries across the world. And so, with China and specifically, they have a document for everything. There are guidelines on what to achieve by when. There are timelines. And yet, we see the purges happening. We see shakeups in even academic universities affiliated with the PLA. And then, with all of that training and focus on combat preparedness, if we see the erstwhile defense ministers, the vice chairman of the CMC, and one of the members of the CMC all going away, it, as you rightly pointed out, doesn't signal trust. And then it also sends the wrong message to the grassroots, which brings into question readiness to actually engage in war. So I think that's always an interesting aspect to watch out for. But thank you so much for that. And this has been a really fascinating conversation. But if I may, I would have one final question for you. And this, at least for us, is $1 million one. And we'd love to have your take on it. So sitting there in the US and studying China, what would you say is the US's endgame with China? Or what do you think should be the US's endgame with China? Because for us in India, both New Delhi and Bangalore, a G2 situation is a bit of a problem. But perhaps that degree of managed competition may be what suits Washington right now. It definitely is advantageous to Beijing. Like you said, the US and its firms have played a lot of good part in kind of helping China's economic rise. So would you say that should be the end game to stabilize relations? Or would you say that there is a need to take the structural competitiveness more seriously, even as there is negotiation on global issues?
I am going to differentiate between what I think the end game is and what I think it should be. And they are actually related, but I'm going to make sure I can lay this out clearly. So the US end game, I'll be quite honest, it is about figuring out some of the domestic economic challenges that we're facing. And I said this earlier in my trip here to India, where I was talking to someone about, there's always that question, well, how did Trump get elected? And I say, what some people outside of America don't understand is there are segments of the American population that feel like they've been left behind. And that's legitimate. And I don't want to downplay that because I do think sometimes we've had politicians in the past say really negative things about it. And I say this because I grew up in a rural part of the United States. I have a home in the rural part, and there's sometimes this dismissing of those concerns, but those concerns are legitimate. The economy has changed, and the end game is, we want good jobs for our people. This is not unique to the US. This is most countries. They want to provide economic opportunities for their citizens. So I think right now the end game is how do we figure out a system where Americans can have a stable economy, a safe and prosperous economy. What I think that means in terms of what I think the end game should be is I don't think we can do this alone. And I don't think we should look at things like this sort of idea that we can do this alone. Like I said this once, America first to me is America alone. And I don't think that's how it should be. I think the end game should be a safe, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. So that is what we want, because when the economy grows in this region and U.S. businesses can work with businesses in these parts of the world, we all benefit. Now, there are times when you don't. Sometimes I talk about this in terms of economics. There are some issues that I think are not zero sum, that everyone can grow and benefit. A lot of economic relationships are like this. We can grow the economy and then everyone benefits. But there are some issues that are zero sum. So the biggest challenge in East Asia is land and territory. Territory is zero sum. If the land border dispute between China and India doesn't get solved, someone potentially loses. if China takes over islands in the South China Sea, the Philippines, so there are zero-sum issues in international politics. I'm not going to pretend like there isn't. But I think for the U.S. to achieve its endgame, we do need to still think about how do we work with the world and take advantage, and how do we work with countries so that both of our economies grow. Because that is the issue, and I think that is why we have the domestic political situation we have in the U.S. right now. It is the economic challenges we're facing. I just don't think we can solve those on our own. I think there are people that maybe think that. I don't think that's the case. I think the global economy is still far too integrated. And quite frankly, this is where governments and industry are different. Businesses and industry still want to go out and engage the world because that's how they increase their financial bottom line and make money and make business. And so we still have a lot of potential there in the United States. And that is different than government policy, quite frankly.
Right. Wise words, Dr. Hurlevy. Thank you so much for your insights today. It definitely gave me a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure our listeners had a bunch of interesting things to take away as well. And I think we're all, whether in the corporate sector or in academia and think tanks, or of course, even in the government, we're all just trying to figure out how to navigate the US-China dynamic, having each individual relations with Beijing and Washington of our own. And one thing always keeps becoming evidently clear, which is that how US and China deal with each other will impact India and everyone else in the world. So I think what you've talked about today is very valuable stuff. So thank you so much once again for your time today. And if I may take a moment to speak to the listener directly, we have launched the 2025 edition of the China Challenge survey at the Takshashila Institution. So if you also have an opinion that you would like to share, we have 12 questions in that survey. The link will be in the description. So please share your insights with us and help India shape its China policy in the 21st century. So thank you so much again, Dr. Hurlevy, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.